Chapter 1. The Cry at Dawn. The streets of Seoul held their breath in the hours before sunrise. Frost clung to parked motorcycles and empty soju bottles, crystallizing under street lamps that flickered like dying stars. Young Hyunwoo pulled his thin jacket tighter as he dismounted his delivery scooter, its engine ticking as it cooled. 38 years old, with hands that still bore faint scars from flames, he moved through the cold like a ghost revisiting familiar haunts. The last order had been delivered. Now came the second shift, the one no one saw. He walked the alleys behind convenience stores and restaurants, eyes scanning for aluminum cans that glinted in the darkness. Each one was worth a few coins. Enough coins bought rice. Rice meant another day. His breath formed small clouds that dissolved into nothing. Then he heard it, a sound so faint, he almost convinced himself it was the wind threading through the alley. But it came again, fragile and insistent. A cry, not the wail of a cat or the creak of metal, but something unmistakably human. Hyunwoo stopped beside a dumpster, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. He pulled back the lid. There, nestled between black garbage bags, lay a bundle wrapped in a blanket too thin for winter. A newborn, no more than days old, with skin pale as paper and lips beginning to turn blue. His hands froze. For 3 years, he had trained himself not to feel, not to remember the small hand that had reached for him. Through smoke, the faces he couldn't save, his wife's final whisper live. But he had only survived, dragging himself through days like a man underwater. The baby's eyes opened, dark and searching. Hyunwoo's chest constricted. He thought of walking away, of calling someone, of letting the cold make the choice for him. Instead, his scarred hands reached down and lifted the child from the trash. The baby's cry softened against his chest, and something ancient stirred in him, not quite hope, but its precursor, the recognition that life persisted, even in the cruelest cold. "I have to keep this life alive," he whispered to the empty alley. Dawn began its slow arrival, painting the sky in shades of gray. Hyunwoo turned toward his boarding house, the bundle warm against his heart. Walking away from the dumpster and into an uncertain light. Chapter 2. The Nameless Child. The boarding house room measured 3 meters by 4, barely enough space for a mattress, a hot plate, and the careful arrangement of a life reduced to essentials. Hyunwoo laid the baby on his only blanket, and stared at her in the gray morning light. She was impossibly small, her fingers like flower stems, her breathing shallow but steady. He had no formula, no diapers, no idea what he was doing, but he had survived fire, and grief, and 3 years of methodical emptiness. Surely he could learn this. The first day passed in a blur of improvisation. He bought supplies with what little cash he had, mixing formula with trembling hands, testing the temperature on his wrist, the way he'd seen his wife do once, years ago. The baby drank hungrily, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that unsettled him. She had no name, no identity beyond the fact that someone had thrown her away like garbage. "Sorry," Hyunwoo murmured on the 3rd night, watching her sleep. Sound. Because she had cried out when the world wanted her to be silent. Because her existence made noise in the void he'd been living in. When her tiny hand wrapped around his finger, something cracked open inside him, a door he'd welded shut after the fire. Warmth, unbearable and terrifying, flooded through the gap, but warmth drew shadows. On the 5th day, he noticed the hallway CCTV's red light had gone dark. The landlady mentioned it had stopped working suddenly, her voice heavy with suspicion about the strange sounds coming from his room at night. On the 7th day, footsteps stopped outside his door at 2 a.m. The doorknob turned slowly, testing. Hyunwoo sat in the darkness with sorry pressed to his chest, holding his breath until the footsteps retreated. On the 9th day, a black SUV with tinted windows appeared across the street. It stayed for hours, engine running, exhaust smoking in the winter air. That night, while changing Sori's makeshift diaper, he saw it, a small metal band around her ankle, the kind hospitals used. But this one bore no hospital name. Just a cold engraving E14. Hyunwoo's blood turned to ice. This child wasn't abandoned by accident. She was evidence. She was hunted. I must protect her myself, he said, to the empty room, and meant it with a ferocity that surprised him. Outside, the SUV's headlights cut through the darkness, patient and watchful. Chapter 3. The Missing Seven. The internet cafe at 4 a.m. smelled of instant noodles and energy drinks. Hyunwoo sat in the corner booth, Sori sleeping in a carrier strapped to his chest, hidden beneath his oversized jacket. His fingers moved across the keyboard with desperate precision. E14. Project E. Biotech Infant. The search results materialized like fragments of a nightmare. A buried news article from 2 years ago. Barely a footnote in the science section. 7 infants missing from private research facility. The story had died within 48 hours, replaced by political scandals and celebrity gossip. But the archived forums told a different story. Conspiracy theorists and whistleblowers had pieced together what mainstream media wouldn't touch. EcoGen Bio, a pharmaceutical company with government contracts. Project E, an experiment in genetic engineering that had supposedly been terminated. 7 subjects, designated E1 through E7, created through gene fusion technology. Hyunwoo's hands shook as he scrolled through technical jargon that turned his stomach. Human cloning ethics violations, synthetic DNA integration, designer genome sequences. A leaked document showed a spreadsheet, 7 rows, 7 designation numbers. E14 appeared in the 5th row, marked with a red asterisk and a single word: uncollected. The baby against his chest stirred, making a small sound like a question. Sori wasn't abandoned, she was hidden, or lost, or stolen. The child was living proof of someone's crime, a crime significant enough to erase news stories and silence reporters. He found more pieces: a scientist's obituary, car accident, a lab technician's suicide note posted anonymously, a journalist who had covered the story now worked in advertising and refused interviews. Every person connected to Project E had either vanished, died, or gone silent. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't negligence, it was orchestration. Hyunwoo closed the browser windows, cleared the history, paid in cash. Walking back into the pre-dawn cold, he thought about going to the police, about doing the right thing, the legal thing. But rightness required a system that functioned. Legality required justice that existed. If he handed Sori over, she would disappear into the same machinery that had created her. Evidence didn't get protected, it got destroyed. If I hand her over, she'll die, Hyunwoo whispered to the frozen air. Sori made a small noise against his chest, warm and alive and utterly dependent on his next choice. He turned away from the police station, 3 blocks south, and walked toward the only person he could still trust. Chapter 4. The Pursuers. Park Ji-ho lived in a small apartment near the hospital, where he worked nights as a paramedic. They had served together in the fire department. Once, before the accident that took everything from Hyunwoo, Ji-ho had attended the funeral, stood in the rain, beside the graves, and never asked questions when Hyunwoo stopped returning calls. Now Hyunwoo stood outside his door at dawn, Sori bundled against the cold, wondering if friendship could survive 3 years of silence. Ji-ho opened the door in his scrubs, exhaustion lining his face. His eyes went from Hyunwoo's haunted expression to the carrier, and something shifted in his features, recognition of a crisis beyond explanation. "Come in," Ji-ho said, stepping aside. But there was no time for explanations. 2 days passed in Ji-ho's apartment, 2 days of relative safety, while Hyunwoo told fragments of the story and Ji-ho listened with growing alarm. 2 days before the world found them again. It happened at midnight. Hyunwoo woke to the sound of footsteps in the boarding house hallway, his boarding house, where he'd been foolish enough to return for his few possessions. Heavy boots, multiple sets, the methodical rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were going. His door exploded inward. 3 men in black suits, moving with military precision. The lead figure's voice was flat, bureaucratic. "Give us the child. It's government business." Hyunwoo grabbed Sori and ran down the hallway, through the emergency exit, metal stairs clanging under his feet as shouts erupted behind him. Rain had started, cold and sudden, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected nothing but darkness and neon. The abandoned laundromat at the end of the alley offered the only shelter, broken windows covered with cardboard, machines gutted and silent. Hyunwoo crouched behind an overturned dryer, Sori pressed against his chest, both of them soaking wet and shaking. Through the broken window, he watched flashlight beams sweep the street, heard radios crackling with coordinates and commands. These weren't police, they were hunters, and Sori was their prey. The baby whimpered softly. Hyunwoo covered her mouth gently, his own heart hammering. This time, I'll protect her, he breathed into her damp hair, not a promise to her, but to himself, to his wife, to his daughter, to everyone he'd failed before. The flashlights moved away, the street fell quiet except for rain. Hyunwoo pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, and sent a single message to Jiho. They came. Need help. The response arrived 3 minutes later, address following. Stay hidden. Dawn was still hours away when Jiho's car pulled into the alley, headlights cutting through rain. He drove them to an empty storage facility on the city's edge. Industrial, anonymous, forgotten. You can't run forever, Jiho said as he unlocked the unit. Hyunwoo carried Sori inside, into temporary darkness and temporary safety. I know, he replied, but he would run as long as he had to. Chapter 5. Blizzard of Choices. The defunct laboratory sat at the edge of an industrial park, where businesses went to die. Eco-Gen Bio's sign had been removed, leaving only the ghost of letters on weathered concrete. Jiho had found the location through hospital records. A colleague who'd processed strange blood work orders 2 years ago. Samples marked with E designations that disappeared from the system. They broke in through a service entrance, the lock rusted and yielding. Inside, the facility exhaled the stale air of abandonment. Overturned chairs, filing cabinets, with drawers hanging open like tongues, floors covered in scattered papers that had dried into brittle artifacts. Jiho moved through the wreckage with his phone's flashlight, while Hyunwoo followed, Sori asleep against his chest. The paramedic had a methodical way of searching, checking each room with practiced efficiency until he found what they'd come for. The director's office, a wall safe, door ajar, contents pillaged, except for a single folder wedged in the back corner. Jiho pulled it free and opened it under the flashlight's beam. The documents inside were clinical, cold, genetic sequences, developmental milestones, subject designations E1 through E7, each with photos infants that looked disturbingly similar, variations on a theme, and there, in the 5th position E14, marked with a red stamp uncollected. Below the photo, a single line in Korean: human clone subject 14. The words hung in the dusty air like a verdict. Jiho closed the folder slowly. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who'd been hoping to be wrong. You have to surrender her, Hyunwoo. This is beyond us. She needs proper care. Government protection. Government protection? Hyunwoo's laugh was bitter. The government that made her. That's hunting her. She's evidence of a crime. They'll have to protect her once it's exposed. She'll disappear into a lab, or worse. Jiho stepped closer, his flashlight casting harsh shadows across his face. She's not actually human, Hyunwoo. She's a clone. You understand what that means? Hyunwoo felt Sori's small hand curl against his chest, her heartbeat steady beneath his palm. If she can cry and hold my hand, she's human, he said quietly. The words fell between them like stones. Jiho shook his head, something breaking in his expression. I can't be part of this anymore. You're risking everything for something that was never meant to exist. He left the folder on the desk and walked out, footsteps echoing through the empty building. The sound of his car starting outside cut through the silence, then faded into distance. Hyunwoo stood alone in the darkness, holding the baby who was and wasn't human, according to definitions made by people who'd never held her. Outside, snow had begun to fall, not the gentle kind, but the blizzard that comes with a temperature drop so sudden it steals breath from lungs. He stepped into it, feeling the cold immediately knife through his thin jacket. Sori whimpered against him, her skin growing cool despite the carrier. Without hesitation, Hyunwoo removed his jacket and wrapped it around her, layering it over the carrier. The wind hit his bare arms like teeth. His breath came in gasps, but Sori's small body warmed beneath the extra covering, her crying softening to silence. "She's the one keeping me alive," Hyunwoo whispered through chattering teeth, and began walking through the blizzard, toward the only sanctuary he could remember. Chapter 6. The church. The church had been abandoned for 5 years, its congregation scattered to newer buildings with better heating and parking lots, but the structure remained Gothic stone that refused to crumble, stained glass windows cracked, but intact, pews covered in dust like fallen snow. Hyunwoo had been here only once before, 3 years ago, when they'd held the funeral service for his wife and daughter. He pushed through the heavy wooden door as the blizzard screamed behind him. Inside, the temperature was barely warmer, but the wind stopped. Silence wrapped around them like a blanket. Sori had stopped crying an hour ago, a stillness that terrified him more than her wails. He unwrapped her carefully, checking her skin, her breathing. She was pale but alive, her chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. There were candles on the altar. Someone had left them, perhaps other transients seeking shelter. Hyunwoo lit 3 with matches from his pocket, their flames stuttering to life and casting dancing shadows across the walls. He sat in the front pew, holding Sori close to the candlelight's meager warmth. The last time he'd sat here, he had been surrounded by black suits and murmured condolences that meant nothing. Jiho had been beside him, a steady presence, while the priest spoke words about heaven and eternal rest. But Hyunwoo had heard only the roar of flames in his memory, the way the house had become an inferno in minutes, how he'd pulled neighbors from the building but couldn't reach his own family in time, how his wife's hand had appeared through the smoke for one impossible moment, reaching toward him, how her lips had formed a single word before the ceiling collapsed. Live. He had survived. His punishment was to continue surviving. Sori stirred against him, her small mouth opening in a silent cry. Hyunwoo rocked her gently, his eyes burning with exhaustion and smoke from 3 years ago that never quite cleared. "I couldn't save them," he whispered to the empty church, "but maybe I can save you." The candles flickered. Outside, the blizzard howled like something alive and furious. Then footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through snow, coming closer. Hyunwoo stood, holding Sori tighter, looking for another exit, but the footsteps were already at the door. The hinges groaned as it opened, admitting a gust of frozen wind and a figure in a long dark coat. The man was in his 50s, gray-haired, with the face of someone who hadn't slept in months. Snow clung to his shoulders like epaulets. In his right hand, he carried a gun, not raised, but present, undeniable. He stopped 10 feet from Hyunwoo, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. When he spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd traveled a very long distance to arrive at this exact moment. "That child isn't human," the man said. Hyunwoo met his eyes across the candlelit space. His own voice emerged calm, certain, the voice of someone who'd already made every choice that mattered. "Then why did she hold my hand?" Hyunwoo asked. The question hung between them like a prayer waiting for answer. The candles burned, the baby breathed. The man with the gun stood perfectly still, something crumbling behind his eyes. Outside, the blizzard raged on, indifferent to the small drama of humanity, playing out in the forgotten church. Chapter 7. The gunshot and the silence. The man's hand trembled, not much, just a slight quiver that made the gun's silhouette waver in the candlelight. He stared at Sori, and something in his expression shifted from determination to something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, or regret, wearing the mask of duty. Minutes passed. The candles burned lower. Neither man moved. Finally, the stranger's shoulders sagged, as if invisible weight had suddenly doubled. He lowered the gun to his side but didn't release it. His eyes remained fixed on the baby, not with the cold assessment of a hunter, but with the haunted gaze of someone confronting the consequences of choices made in sterile laboratories, far from the mess of actual life. "I worked on that experiment," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was the lead geneticist. We told ourselves we were advancing science, pushing boundaries that needed to be pushed, creating life that could resist disease, live longer, be better." He took a step closer, and Hyunwoo instinctively backed toward the altar, shielding Sori with his body. The man stopped, raising his free hand in something like surrender. "Those children were never meant to suffer," he continued. "They were never meant to be real, just experiments, data points." But then they cried. They reached for things. They looked at us with eyes that asked questions we couldn't answer. His voice cracked. "So we terminated the project, destroyed the records, made them disappear. 7 children who never officially existed, erased from a world that wasn't ready for them. That's what we told ourselves we were doing, protecting everyone." Hyunwoo's arms tightened around Sori. "You were covering up murder." "Yes." The single word fell like a stone into still water. "Yes, we were." The man looked at the gun in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. His fingers adjusted their grip, and Hyunwoo tensed, ready to run, to fight, to do anything to keep Sori alive. But the man didn't raise the weapon toward them. Instead, slowly, deliberately, he turned it. The barrel pressed against his own temple. "I can't undo this," the man said, his voice steady now, resolved. "But she deserves freedom. They all deserved that." "Wait." Hyunwoo started forward. The gunshot shattered the silence. The sound crashed through the church like thunder contained in stone walls, echoing and re-echoing until it became something larger than noise, a declaration, an ending, a horrible punctuation mark on years of guilt. The man crumpled, his body hitting the floor with a sound that was somehow louder than the shot itself, final and irreversible. Sori screamed a piercing wail that cut through the ringing in Hyunwoo's ears. He stumbled backward against the altar, his legs giving out, sliding down until he sat on the cold floor with his back against carved wood. The baby shrieked in his arms, alive and terrified and utterly dependent on him, and he couldn't stop the sob that tore from his chest. 3 years of holding everything inside the fire, the loss, the guilt that ate at him every waking moment broke open. He wept into Sori's blanket while she cried against him, both of them making sounds of grief that the empty church absorbed without judgment. Time became meaningless. He held her and cried, rocking back and forth, unable to look at the body 10 feet away, unable to process what had just happened. The man had come to kill them and instead had killed himself. Redemption or cowardice, atonement or escape. Hyunwoo's exhausted mind couldn't distinguish between them. Gradually, Sori's crying softened to hiccups, then to silence. His own tears dried, leaving salt tracks on his frozen cheeks. The candles had burned down to stubs, their light wavering but persistent. Outside, the wind's howl faded, the blizzard's fury gentled to something softer, the kind of snow that falls when storms exhaust themselves. Through the cracked stained glass, the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, not bright, not warm, but there, present, beginning. Hyunwoo looked down at Sori. Her eyes were open, watching him with that unsettling intensity infants sometimes had, as if she understood everything and forgave him for his weakness. He pulled her closer, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and let the dawn's gray light wash over them both. Chapter 8. Winter's Song. Morning arrived in fragments. First, a shaft of pale light through the broken stained glass, painting colors across the stone, floor blue and gold and crimson, like hope translated into spectrum. Then the silence that follows storms, when the world holds its breath before beginning again. Finally, warmth small and insufficient, but real as the sun climbed higher and touched the eastern wall. Hyunwoo had not moved from his position against the altar. Sori lay against him, awake now, her dark eyes tracking the colored light as it shifted across the walls. The body of the scientist remained where it had fallen, a problem he would need to address but couldn't yet face. For now, there was only this moment, the two of them breathing in synchrony, alive despite everything that had tried to end them. His mind felt scraped clean, emptied of the constant noise that had plagued him for 3 years. The guilt remained, but it had transformed into something else. Not forgiveness, he would never forgive himself for failing to save his family, but perhaps acceptance, perhaps the understanding that survival was not betrayal, that continuing to live was not the same as forgetting the dead. Sori made a small sound, her hand reaching toward the colored light. Her fingers opened and closed, grasping at nothing, and Hyunwoo found himself smiling, actually smiling, the muscles in his face moving in patterns they'd forgotten. Then she turned her face toward him, her expression serious and focused. Her mouth worked, forming shapes around breath and intention. When the sound emerged, it was barely a whisper, consonant and vowel struggling into existence. "Daddy," Sori said. The word hung in the air like the light through stained glass, impossible, beautiful, transforming everything it touched. Hyunwoo's smile deepened, became something that reached his eyes. For the first time since the fire, not the manic grin of someone who'd lost their grip on reality, but the quiet expression of someone who'd found a reason to hold on. In the distance, police sirens began their familiar wail. Someone must have heard the gunshot, or seen his tracks in the snow, or simply followed the trail of a man who'd been running for too long. The sound grew closer, inevitable and patient. Hyunwoo did not tense, did not plan an escape route, did not calculate odds or prepare explanations. He simply stood, gathering Sori carefully in his arms, adjusting her blanket against the morning cold. He walked past the scientist's body with a whispered, "Thanks for what?" He wasn't entirely sure. Perhaps for choosing to end the hunt, perhaps for the strange gift of his final words, perhaps simply for leaving them alive. The church door opened easily despite its age and weight. Outside, the world had been remade by snow, everything sharp softened, everything ugly covered. The city transformed into something clean and new. The sirens were 3 blocks away now, maybe less, but Hyunwoo felt no urgency. Whatever came next would come. He stepped onto the church steps, snow crunching beneath his feet, Sori warm against his chest. The morning air bit at his exposed skin, but he welcomed it. Pain meant life, cold meant sensation. Feeling anything at all was a victory. "Let's live now," Hyunwoo whispered to the baby in his arms, to himself, to his wife and daughter, wherever they existed beyond flame and memory. Above them, the church bell began to toll. No human hand pulled the rope, but wind perhaps, or settling snow, or the universe acknowledging their survival. The sound rolled across the frozen morning, clear and bright, and impossibly hopeful. Snow began to fall again, gentle this time. Each flake caught the light like a small promise, drifting down from heaven or chance or whatever force governed the survival of impossible things. Hyunwoo descended the steps, holding the child, who was and wasn't human, walking toward whatever waited in the world beyond this moment of grace. The sirens grew closer, the snow fell, the church bells sang, and for the first time in 3 years, young Hyunwoo was not running from death, but walking toward life.